King Og of Bashan was famously large. He was one of the rulers that stood between Moses and the Israelites and the Promised Land. He is mentioned in both Numbers and Deuteronomy as an intimidating enemy. His size is only described by describing his huge iron bed. It was something like 14 feet long and 6 feet wide. Assuming he gave himself room to toss and turn through the night as we all do, could he have been more than 10 foot tall? He may have been around Goliath's size. God's encouragement to his people when they faced King Og is repeated in Deuteronomy as it was stated in Numbers. In both accounts, the Lord said to Moses, "Do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands along with his whole army and his land." Now, we don't know why the giant king marched out his army against the Lord's people. It's understandable that he assessed this nation marching through his land as a threat, and it's also understandable that a giant would be used to dealing with threats with intimidation and force. But we don't know if he had a particular bone to pick with God's people or with God himself. Og ruled Bashan, and for that matter, Moses led Israel, in the days when a nation was indistinguishable from its religion. Og picking a fight with Moses was the same as Bashan picking a fight with Israel was the same as Og's gods picking a fight with Israel's God. Unfortunately for Og and Bashan, their gods weren't, and they had picked a fight against the God who is. And the God who isn't dumb. He doesn't say, "Do not be afraid," unless there is a very good reason to be afraid that he wants his people to ignore. If he needed a bed the size of the one he had, then Og was huge and intimidating, and it would have been easy to associate his physical size and power with the might of his army and with the power of his gods. Israel had good reasons to be afraid. God tells them not to be because he recognizes that they are. But God also says something surprising enough to replace good reasons to be afraid with better reasons not to be. Israel looks at Og and trembles until God says, "Do not be afraid of him, for I have delivered him into your hands." That very real and very scary giant that you're looking at, God says, I have already beaten him. And in both Numbers and Deuteronomy, the battle that Moses and Israel fought against Og and Bashan is hardly described at all. Numbers merely says, "So they struck him down, together with his sons and his whole army, leaving them no survivors, and they took possession of his land." And when Deuteronomy retells Israel about their victory, it only adds that the Lord our God also gave into our hands Og, king of Bashan, and all his army. God isn't dumb. Whatever intimidates you, God knows that there are very good reasons for you to be afraid. But if you'll ignore those reasons long enough to listen to the surprising thing God has to tell you, he will surprise you enough to replace those good reasons to be afraid with better reasons not to be. With the fact that no matter what you're scared of, God has already beaten it for you. I don't want to start an argument with anyone, but no modern nation is indistinguishable from its religion. But you, the individual Christian listening to this podcast, by virtue of the fact that you call yourself a Christian, are inviting the world to make no distinction between picking a fight with you and picking a fight with your God. By faith in Jesus Christ, you put your will in line with God's so that you don't have enemies that aren't God's enemies. And those enemies are huge, and they make themselves comfortable in this world that cradles them in beds and calls them kings. Sin picks a fight with you, which is the same as death picking a fight with Christianity, which is the same as Satan picking a fight with Christianity's God. And sin, death, and Satan are real, realer than the gods of Og and Bashan, and still God is realer, the realist. And the realist God who is tells you to not be afraid because he has already beaten them, no matter how big they are or how real they seem. And God wrote a whole book that goes into amazing detail in describing how the battle between your enemies and your God wasn't even close. And God throws into that book the odd reference to giant enemies like Og, who draw up battle lines against him and his people only to be defeated the second the battle starts. Before, even. Because God isn't dumb. He knows you have good reasons to be afraid. That's why he gives you better reasons not to be. You and I are dust and breath, loved by God, bought by Jesus. This podcast is written and produced by me, Ethan Cherney, a WELS pastor serving Our Savior Lutheran Church in Pomona, California. Get in touch on Facebook at Dust and Breath Pod, on Twitter at Dust Breath Pod, or by emailing dustandbreathpod@gmail.com. Outro music arranged and performed by Mr. Peter Shawy, who is, like gold, refined 7 times. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you could leave a review in iTunes or just share an episode on social media, I'd really appreciate it. It's the only way other people can find the show. Now, go do what God made you to do. Be who God called you to be. Go see what God can do with dust and breath and faith in Jesus, his Son.